Thank you everybody for coming. I'm so happy to see all of you. I'm Louise Innes, and I'm president of the Bourne Society for Historic Preservation, across the street of the Briggs McDermott House. We have two wonderful speakers today, and I'm sure that most of you know them. Nameth is going to talk about the kitchen garden, which she picked up on, which I believe Laurie York might have started.
Sure, I'm going to take that.
Right?
Yep.
And Kathy Sargent O'Neill will pick up on the gardens at the fence. When you go by the yellow fence, you see the gardens. The garden club has been keeping that up for a long time. So thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope to learn more myself.
All right, well, we're going to talk about the kitchen garden. And as Louise told you, it was initially inspired by Laurie. It was cared for many, many years by the garden club. And about 4 years ago, the ladies who were taking care of it had really just kind of reached exhaustion. And I agreed to take over that little piece of earth. So I want to tell that journey to you. Now, the first thing you have to do is you have to travel back in time. So, you know, this is a garden as it would have been planted on that house in the 1850s. And you begin that with all kinds of questions. You know, what was it like then? I mean, we kind of know our history, but just let's go back a little bit. So in the 1850s, it was horses and walking and bicycles, horse-drawn plows. It was a big farm over there. No tractors. I remember Laurie got a tractor for her 50th birthday. Whale oil lamps, no electricity, no flushing toilets. This is life in the 1850s. And the thing that really struck me was this was downtown Bourne. So if you think about it, that was a grand house in the center of downtown. When it was first built, this school wasn't here. There were two general stores on the street. So on the corner across from the medical office building where there are now apartments, that was a general store. There was a general store down the street, and there was a post office. So this was a thriving downtown area. The house actually started out small, a single-story house built in 1802 by Joshua Keene, and his granddaughter, and I love this name, Thursday. Isn't that just a beautiful name? She married a guy named George Briggs, and George apparently had to, step up and impress Thurza because he had to rebuild the house. He raised the roof, more than doubled the size of the house, added the kitchen on the back, and at some time later, and Kathy will tell you about this, added a porch, which isn't there now. Now, the house is a labor of love. And many of you are part of the Briggs Historic Preservation Society, and you know this labor, and Louise has been at this from the beginning, from the 1970s, when the labor began with saving the house. And then in the 1980s, the Abtuxet Garden Club adopted the gardens. And Laurie designed the kitchen garden, another lady did the flower garden in the front. I remember the story that Laurie told me that they put a trellis up over the kitchen door in the back, and they planted morning glories over it. And can you just imagine? Trellis is gone, there are no morning glories today, but just imagine how magnificent that entrance was to the house. And lo and behold, they won first place in the Cape Cod House and Garden Tour that year. So magnificent. Then from the 80s to 2020, every year the gardens have been refreshed, they've been maintained. But life got a little sad in the kitchen garden, and that's when I took over and asked myself, what would they grow in the garden? And I'm following a lady who has a magnificent history and knowledge of herbs. I didn't. And so you start to research, and the first question that I wanted to know was, well, what were they growing in Victorian gardens at the time? And so I began to do some research and began reading about what was going on in British gardens in the 1850s and how much of that was being reflected in America. And I discovered that many of the plants, many of the herbs that were available in colonial times and were being grown over at the Abtuxet Trading Post were really the same herbs that they were using in Victorian times. And so that was kind of an eye-opener to me, this continuity of use of these. On the other hand, the 1800s was sort of the beginning of commercialization of seeds and nurseries in America. So by the 1850s, the lady of the house could be looking at a seed catalog and could be ordering seeds for things that, you know, weren't just available next door. Out of all that research, the conclusion was, in my mind, that they'd select some herbs so they could step out the door, you know, and add that flavoring to that soup or that stew. They might have something growing there for medicinal purposes. One of the things Lori told me that is still there today is they would plant things to deter insects from going into the house. And tansy was one of those plants, and that is still growing by the back door. And then Margot Jenkins, who's in our club over both gardens, she advised me, now Pat, we got bunnies, we got deer, so see if you can't find plants that'll be deer resistive and bunny resistive. So this is what the garden looked like about a month after I started to work on it. When I say a month after, because that path of stones that you see was buried. And Lori met me at the garden one day, and it was all covered really with dead plants. And she said, Pat, there's a path here. I laid some stones here. And so my first step was like an archaeological dig. And I began ripping out plants. Lori said, now don't take out the iris. So you see the little bit of green there? She says, those are white iris, and they grew those because they could use the roots in potpourri, and it helped with the smell. So I left that, took out almost everything else, and began to unearth the stones. Like I said, I felt I was on an archaeological dig. My partner in all this is a lady named Marilyn Crane, who's also a member of the garden club. She helped me and was digging right along with me, and there's Lori, our historian. Now, archaeological digs always have to have at least one surprise, and this was mine. I was digging a hole about 3 foot deep by the kitchen door because I wanted to put a rose in, a Rosa rugosa, the salt rose of the Cape. And lo and behold, I found that glass bottle. And to think it's 3 feet down, that is a little medicinal bottle. In those days, of course, there were no mass-produced drugs. You know, you wouldn't go to the pharmacy and pick something off the shelf. You might go into a local pharmacy and say, I needed this and this, and they'd mix it for you. And you would get a small bottle with a little cork top on it. And often, opium was in there to help ease your pains. So, Louise has this little bottle. Yeah. Most medicines, however, were really homegrown. And a common medicine for strength and energy was a drink made from chamomile flowers. So if you wonder why you got a bag of chamomile tea, I am trying to grow chamomile over there. Bunnies ate about 2/3 of it last year, but there's a little plant left, and you know we're going to keep working on it. As your handout, this is hard to read on the screen, but I prepared a map of what would be planned. I reviewed that map with Louise and with Margot Jenkins, sent a copy to Lori, trying to make sure that it was correct. The garden has morphed a little bit because a couple things didn't make it the first year. Bunnies, I'll tell you that in a minute. But this is what is there now. And then 2 stories along the way to just kind of quickly wrap up. The first is bunnies and echinacea, and the other is a bird and a great bush. So this is what the garden looked like about a month ago. The white iris was in magnificent bloom, just beautiful. And then you can see the stretch on the back wall that's empty. Well, why is that empty? I want you to know I spent about $50 in echinacea plants trying to fill that with cone flowers. I mean, I put in 3. The bunnies ate them to the ground. I was determined. I read what can you do to deter bunnies, One article said, take Irish Spring and shave it around the plants.
Yeah.
And of course I did that, and the bunnies ate them anyway. And I went and I bought turmeric and they ate those to the ground. So anyway, that's the bunny story. The other story was last summer, when the garden was first put in, one of the ladies in the garden club donated a Concord grape bush. Now the Concord grape bush is kind of unique to the history of Boston. It was developed in Massachusetts, ultimately became a very big commercial grape used for religious services, especially in the Jewish community, because it was non-alcoholic content. And you see even Concord grapes today in Concord grape jam. So this bush went in back in the 80s, and that's the mom, survives. And lo and behold, last summer, a little birdie took grape seeds over to the other side of the parking lot, and that is the baby growing down. I mean, it was amazing. I was pulling the car out one day from gardening there, and I turned around and there are grapes growing down this thing, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, look at the beautiful magic of Mother Nature. So, just quick references. All the plants have a story to tell. That's one of the things I love about gardening. They have a history, they have a use, and those stories are in part on the back sheet of that. Oh, sorry. One of the plants I'm growing there, and it's been a hard one to grow, is bee balm. It's a little subject to mold in the summertime, but I love bee balm because this is what the colonists drank after the Boston Tea Party. So they were, as we all know, so angry over taxation, they needed an alternate tea, and the leaves of bee balm provided that for them. And with that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Any questions, or I'll turn this over to Kathy. Yes, ma'am.
Have you used the flowers for the bee balm?
I've clipped them and just used them in arrangements. They're also edible though, so.
So for your tea, you use the leaves?
You lose the leaves for the tea, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick question. You went past a slide and I happened to see some books there. One was Laurie York, I saw.
Yes.
What were the others? I didn't know Laurie wrote a book.
Yes, Laurie did write a book, and I think we have 2 copies left for sale. I think we have 2, we gotta reprint it, Laurie. But her book, so he's here with the others. Ancient Herbs by the J. Paul Getty Museum, Flowers and Herbs of Early America by Colonial Williamsburg. That's a magnificent book. And The Victorian Kitchen Garden by Jennifer Davis. These were all books that I bought and read. And by far, the best one was Laurie's.
Oh, wow. I thought that was a very informative lecture. I didn't know you'd taken on that. Thank you.
It's an honor to follow in your footsteps, Laurie.
Well, I think one of the things that was important is Jackie Lingard here? Bobby Lingard.
Yeah.
No, she couldn't come. Okay. Well, the 2 of us decided that, along with the board, that our work on the gardens would be historic.
Yes.
And that we could make the Briggs McDermott House a teaching place.
Yes.
And I think that's the essence behind the work a number of people have put into the house, the gardens, and everything.
You bet.
And it is, it very much is. It's a good
Well,
place.
and of course, all this started before COVID. But if you say, why did I make a map? And why did I put the stuff in the back? It was for that purpose. It was to teach. It was with the thought that maybe children would come and a docent could take the map and walk outside and say, here's what we're looking at, and here's how it was used, and that knowledge would be passed on.
And we're working on that.
Oh, good. All right. Thank you,
There's
everybody.
one other thing I
Yes,
think
ma'am.
that's interesting, and I guess maybe wasn't in the garden when I turned it over to you, and that was I have written down a couple things here. The story about the strawberries because they didn't have that before the Victorian days, although we think of it as big strawberries and glass fish. So they, and knowing how the rabbits are, they're the ones that started the strawberry,
Pots.
yeah, in the, what do you call it, strawberry?
You know those clay pots that
Yeah,
have?
yeah, this is just for the strawberry.
Well, the strawberries was fascinating to me, if I could join with you for a minute.
Yeah, please.
I'm from California, so I'm from an area where in the summertime, there are huge strawberry fields, right? You know, and people go and pick them. And I thought strawberries, this is my ignorance showing, but I thought they came from Mexico, and I thought they, kind of grew in these warm temperate areas. And I get up here and Laurie tells me about strawberries, and I start a little research. And the first commercial strawberries were developed in the 1850s in Massachusetts. And I don't have them growing there because honestly, I just didn't want a freestanding pot there.
Look, I can find the jar. I
Yeah.
did buy one of those jars.
Oh, cool.
And it should be just sitting in the garden with the strawberries.
That would be lovely. That would be lovely.
Right. And the other thing is, the word garden is not used like that. Well, outside the kitchen door, anything could have happened, as you found a glass.
You bet.
I found dishes.
Yeah.
But the word garden wasn't used that much. Everything was grown in patches. Corn patch, squash patch, melon patch. They didn't have guards that they walked up and down
Sure.
and weeded. They could do it. I don't think they had much time to do all that patch. I just wanted to add that gardens is a relatively modern term.
What she told me was that a garden meant it was a space with multiple kinds of plants as opposed to like a potato patch or a squash patch. So the idea of a kitchen garden meant many different plants in one patch.
Sounds good. All right, well, I get out of this so Kathy can take on the next part of the story. Thank you, everybody.
So, as Pat said, we're really happy to be here today to share some history about the ornamental garden in general, and specifically during the time period when the Briggs McDermott House was built, which was in 1802, renovated in 1830, and today. But first, let's turn the clock back many thousands of years, and as the song says, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. So ornamental garden history is that they've been around and in and out of fashion for thousands of years. And here I'm going to give you a few examples of when they were in a really big way. So the Babylonians created the hanging gardens around 700 BC. And the term over the top seems really appropriate for this style. The Italians also made gardens. The Italian Renaissance period was from the mid-1400s to the 1500s. And this picture here, this picture of Villa Mussini near Florence is just one example of the many states that are still, villas that are still in Italy in a very ornate style. And of course, not to be outdone, the French created gardens as well. Versailles is a grand example of the formal landscape architecture of the 17th century. These aren't gardens you take care of by yourself or in your spare time. These are gardens for the rich and famous, or infamous, depending on your reading of history. So fast forward to more recent times. In the 1700s and early 1800s, most land was used for agricultural purposes, unless you were of comfortable means. Ornamental gardens were a luxury. Most people did not have the time nor the money to maintain them. They didn't have help. They were the help. It wasn't until the mid to late 1800s when a greater number of people had more leisure time and money, and home ornamental gardens became an activity they could participate in, creating front yard, what they called parlor gardens, to beautify their property, while they still maintained the practical kitchen patch or garden. In the mid to late 1800s, Victorian garden landscape came into being. Other influences were, in addition to having more time, landscape design and gardening became a thing. Here's some examples, and unfortunately the pictures aren't really that big for you to see, but rural cemetery and park movement started with the creation of the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, and it was the first of its kind, and it spread across the country. It became very, very popular. Actually, when people bought plots at the cemetery, they would go out and visit them while they were still alive and have picnics where their plot was to be. Olmsted also created the Emerald Necklace Park system all through Boston and into Brookline to beautify the city and bring nature into the city. And the Arnold Arboretum was established in 1872. So there was a lot happening in the landscape. And as Pat mentioned, garden magazines and guides became available, and they were very popular, and they encouraged readers to cultivate flowers and were full of gardening landscape tips. For example, botanical bug control, using the petals of chrysanthemums to protect them, and this is something that could be made from a garden that you had in your own home. And the thing that, excuse me, that the chrysanthemum flower provided was pyrethrum. And today we have something called pyrethrin, which is a synthetic form of pyrethrum. And it's also still used today in tick and insect repellents. And in the U.S., they plant breeders and seed companies focused on new plant varieties, and their businesses flourished. People no longer have to rely on their own luck with seed saving. Well, if they're like me, they didn't have any. Nor on the generosity of neighbors and friends to share seeds from their gardens. Many of the annual flowers shown on these seed packets fell out of favor, like amaranthus, which is also known as Love Lies Bleeding, which is now very popular. Hypomodium, which is the cardinal vine. But those that fell out are now back in vogue and are very much sought after. There are other annuals that have remained popular throughout the years, which is snapdragons, argyratum, and helichrysum, which are snow flowers, which also have medicinal purposes. So armed with magazine tips, new seed sources, more leisure time, and expanded money, ornamental home gardening took center stage. Notice the little arrow there shows hostas, and they were called actually funkia in Victorian times. When I was looking through some of my old gardening books that I've purchased over the years, and kept seeing this funkier plant, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Well, it's a hosta. They also, as you can see in this carpet garden, they had impatiens, dusty miller, and begonias. And lawns became a stylish during this period too. And here's an example of a more modest, but still very full ornamental garden from that time period. So let's zoom in on Bourne. In the middle 1800s, it was a small town whose population of approximately 1,200 people were workmen, farmers, fishermen, small business owners, local government officials, and a small number of more affluent families. We're going to look back at the influence, if any, of modern gardening and landscaping on Bourne through the lens of what was happening at the Briggs McDermott House. So, as Pat mentioned, it was renovated to the Greek Revival style by George Briggs in 1830. He added an upper floor and a porch. George was a mover and shaker in the local scene. He was a friend of President Cleveland, who owned a house in Gray Gables known as the Summer White House. George was an early Bourne selectman, the first school committee chairperson, chair of the Barnstable County Commission for many years. His neighborhood was Bourne's town center until the Cape Cod Canal was opened in 1914. This is a very old photo, and it appears that the Briggs heeded the Garden Magazine advice to erect a fence. And in their case, it was a picket style with finials that looked like birdhouses. And the purpose of a fence was to keep man and beast out of the garden. This winter photo from the 1880s shows George Briggs and his family in the yard notice that the two stone carrions marking the entrance into the garden and the stone wall to the right of it. Only a small replica of one of the carrions remains on the property today. The wooden picket fence is much like the one that's there today. Although this old sepia photo is not of high quality, it's the best available of the house, the fence, and the gardens. I'm estimating that it was taken before the property was renovated, as the porch is missing. There is little or no evidence that the suggestions made in the guide to cultivate flowers was incorporated at the house during the Victorian era. It's difficult to determine from this photo taken around 1905 based on the little girl in the carriage, who's Elizabeth, who was born in 1902, so I'm thinking she's about 3 years old. If the plants in front of the fence to the right of the carriage, it looks like a small shrub or a group of flowers, but I think it was probably a shrub. And even with a magnifier, I couldn't really tell. Other photos of the property show that much of what was present were either trees or shrubs and located between the fence and the house. And at that time, they had a much bigger backyard because, as Pat mentioned, it was a dirt road. And so they had a much bigger front yard than they do today. However, it looks like one piece of the advice from the magazine was followed, as this photo shows. This gentleman, maybe Mr. Briggs or Mr. McDermott perhaps, had embraced the idea of a lawn. And I won't say anything about men and lawns.
So he's the guy, huh?
Maybe, who knows? In the 1950s, the fence and most of the trees in the front yard had been removed. Much of the property's road footage present in 1850 was taken when streets were paved and utilities were installed, downsizing the front yard, as you can see. The tree nearest the last remaining cairn was removed late in the 50s and was replaced by a disease-resistant American elm whip provided by the Toxic Garden Club and planted by John and Sue Carpenter in 1994. As you can see from this photo, we now have a beautiful elm that stands well over 30 feet. So Bourne Society for Historic Preservation to the rescue. The house fell into disrepair and was destined for the wrecking ball in the late 70s. It was saved by the Society, who successfully restored the house to reflect the period from 1840 to 1910. They opened the house to the public in 1984 in time for Bourne's Centennial House Tour. And as Pat had mentioned, it won a prize. The fence and ornamental gardens were designed and installed 6 years later in 1990. The garden was designed and installed by members of both the Garden Club and the Society, using plants that would have been used in a Victorian garden. The Briggs McDermott House finally got its Victorian garden. So this is what the fence garden looks like now. We in the garden clubs and members of the Society as well strive to use annuals and perennials in the fence garden that would have been used in Victorian times, such as coleus, begonias, irises, dusty millers, peony, poppy, and daylilies. Snapdragons, impatiens, and obedient plants that aren't so obedient. Shasta daisies, and further down the bed in a wilder section are some catmints, celandine, poppies, and lily of the valley. Later in the season, the perennials and biennials appear. Foxglove, rose campions, and the perennial geranium complement the annuals. This photo was taken during a very droughty summer of 2020, and no matter how much we watered the plants, they always look thirsty. We had successes and setbacks are known as opportunities as well. But that's gardening, so we kept at it. The Garden Club is committed to ensuring that the garden provides beauty and mirrors all the hard work and effort that was made to save this beautiful building. So I'm going to do a little plug for pollinators. So going forward, natives in our future. The Garden Club will be looking at ways to incorporate native plants into the garden in the coming years for several reasons. These plants have evolved here and are better suited to our soils, seasons, and conditions. They support pollinators by providing food, such as pollen and nectar, habitat, and host plants for their young. In addition to helping the pollinators, this will also help our native plant population, which is also challenged by the changing weather patterns, water too much and too little, and deer and bunny overbrowsing. So it's a win-win for the pollinators, for the plants, for the planet, and for us. Next year, look for native flowers that have been incorporated into the garden. You may see coastal goldenrod, New England asters, or other natives there. A big thank you to the staff at the Bourne Historical Society, the board of the Bourne Society of Historic Preservation, members of the Plastic Garden Club who have shared their knowledge and their archives so generously. We hope you've heard something that piqued your interest this afternoon. Thank you for coming. Please join us for a visit to the gardens across the street at the house.